Hello and welcome to the Car Keynote Reviews channel, and welcome to the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, a name that is historic, that came back. And today we're going to do a proper technical review of this massive behemoth, and we're going to take a look outside, inside, underneath it, and everywhere to see how is the Jeep Wagoneer doing in 2024 right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood. And in the Wagoneer or Grand Wagoneer, there are two possible engines, which are technically the same, but we'll talk about them. So this is a new engine that replaces the V8. You have the Hurricane inline 6 3.0 twin turbo direct injected engine. So there's two versions of this magnificent thing. There is the standard output version, and then there is the high output. This is the high output. They are similar in construction. Basically, they took the standard output, modified it to be the high output. Put it this way, the simplest way to put it. But let's dive into them, because this is the future, folks. V8s are gone, and this is going to replace them. Pretty interesting engine. There's a lot to cover here, so let's dive right in. Now, we're going to talk about the differences between the two when they did as we go throughout. Basically, if we say something there's no difference, they're basically the same between the two. Let's start with the very, very top of this engine, mechanical construction. Plastic valve cover at the very top. This is very standard with the automotive industry. Then the cylinder head is actually a single-piece cylinder head, which is very, very massive cylinder head because it's an inline 6. And then this does have dual overhead cam, although we'll talk about the cams in a second here. You do have roller rockers and hydraulic lifters, which is pretty cool. This does have dual variable valve timing. The cylinder head material is aluminum, and this does have a multi-layer steel head gasket. Now, moving on from the cylinder head to the cylinder block, it is also all aluminum, and it's a single piece, which is pretty cool because that just makes things a lot simpler. Now, the crankshaft in this is a steel crankshaft, and this is where we have a little bit of a difference. The rods in the high output version is forged steel. In the regular one, they're not. And the pistons are cast aluminum alloy something, and they have a special coating on them. They do have a hollow crown or a dish for low compression because this is a turbo engine, which is a pretty unique design on the piston there. But otherwise, things are pretty standard. There's nothing really groundbreaking or something strange. Oh, the only thing is the rod caps are a cracked or fractured type. So basically, they make the rod in one piece, then they crack it. So it would have a mechanical adhesion when you put them together. That is actually pretty cool. A little on the delicate side with service, but that is actually pretty cool. You'll see that in really high-end performance engines. And here is a giant SUV with this style rod caps. This is pretty cool. Now, moving on from kind of the basic big bulk components, the timing chains. So this engine has two timing chains and 3 camshafts. Wait a second, did I say 3 camshafts? That was actually not a mistake. Okay, bear with me here. 2 camshafts at the top, pretty standard. Every inline 6 will have that. Then you have one chain that goes from the cams to something in the middle called the third camshaft, or actually the fuel pump camshaft. See, this engine has direct injection only, and normally the high pressure fuel pump sits on the valve cover driven by the camshafts. Life is wonderful. Well, not here. They deemed that too basic and too old-fashioned. We want something modern. Probably for space purposes, they put a third camshaft underneath, and that camshaft has a massive bearing in front of it. Kind of reminds me of an old Porsche IMS bearing, because it's actually a ball bearing, and then that drives the fuel pumps. In the standard version, you have one high pressure fuel pump. In the high output one like this one, you have 2 of them, driven by that little camshaft. Now the chain goes from the gears at the top to this little camshaft in the middle, and then from that camshaft there's another chain that goes to the crank. Don't know why they did it this way, but that's what they deemed necessary. And then the oil pump sits all the way at the bottom. It is mechanically driven by the crank. Pretty good spot for it actually, and it is a electronically controlled variable oil pump. Pretty cool. You can actually see how it jumps in pressure on the screen, which that's the whole reason for them. The computer can really control the oil pressure for ideal operations. Now, this engine has something that is interesting. We looked at a Mazda inline-six, and they really went all out with the complications and whatnot, but here they kept things mostly simple. Front timing cover, it can be removed in the front. You have plenty of space in the front, and the chain is in the front, everything is in the front, fuel pumps are accessible. That is pretty cool. Now, we kind of talked about the fuel system a little bit with the fuel pumps being over there, but let's continue our conversation. This engine is only direct injected, so drive it in unideal driving conditions. Carbon buildup could become an issue, but the injectors, there's 6 direct injectors, and unfortunately they sit right on top of the valve cover. So removing the valve cover became kind of a job and a half, and these injectors will be difficult to remove, and they will be stuck in the future. And I wish they would have put it on the side of the cylinder head, would have been a lot better, but they must have a reason, possibly for performance or emissions, to put them on top, but that's the one downside about them, is serviceability. Now, this engine is, of course, twin turbocharged, which is kind of the norm with these days. You can't just put it in inline-six naturally aspirated and expect it to behave like a V8. This has 2 turbochargers. Interestingly, they're very accessible from the top to a point. I mean, it's not simple, but better than some others that we've seen. You can see them. That's one good thing about them. They are oil and coolant cooled, but there's something interesting about the cooling. So the oil cooled, pretty simple. Engine oil comes in, cools them, drains back into the pan. Life is great. But the coolant, it is not the engine coolant that cools it. It's actually a separate circuit, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Electronic wastegates on both turbos, which is having an electronic component like that in such a hot area of the engine, not always the best deal. Vacuum probably would have been better, but they do work faster, and that's the benefit to them. That's why they do it this way. Now, the charge system on this, it does have a liquid-to-air intercooler that is not integrated into the intake, but it is kind of directly attached to it on the passenger side there. Makes piping easier. You don't have piping on the front, and air-to-air intercoolers. As cool as they look, they're actually not as efficient as liquid-to-air intercoolers, so that's what they went with here. Speaking of liquid-to-air stuff, let's talk about the cooling system, because it's pretty interesting to me how they did this. So first, this car has 2 cooling systems. One of them is for the engine. Really nothing groundbreaking about that part. Mechanical water pump, regular good old thermostat. Coolant goes into the engine, goes to the radiator, goes to the heater core. No fancy valves or anything. Very basic, old school cooling system. But where things get interesting is the second cooling system, which is the low pressure cooling system. It's only up to 5 psi. And in addition to that second cooling system, going to the intercooler and cooling the charge and whatnot, it actually cools the turbos as well. Something pretty interesting to me, and I want to kind of do a cross-check. Do other manufacturers do this? Because usually they use the coolant from the engine to cool the turbos, but this one uses kind of a separate system for that, the low-pressure one. Now, this second coolant circuit does have an electronic water pump. It does have a 3-way coolant valve, which is something you expect to see on the main circuit, but it doesn't. It just have it on the second circuit. And then the very front of the engine, you have a single serpentine belt or drive belt with a very basic belt tensioner. Now, the belt goes from the crank to the compressor, water pump. There's one idler, and then the alternator on the other side. Of course, this has electronic steering, as we'll look at in a little bit. But very simple belt, takes you no more than 5-10 minutes. There's plenty of space in the front. And that is the nice thing about this. Some of the items on top of the engine, and now let's switch into kind of mechanic's eyes view. Some access to the back of the engine with inline-sixes is difficult, and this makes it a lot more difficult because the engine sits so back. They're trying to push most of the engine beyond the kind of behind the drive axle. So access to the back is very difficult. There's a single coolant pipe that is actually common on this engine to leak. It is extremely difficult. As sometimes you got to pull the engine out, pull the body off to get to it. That's how tight things are in the back. That's the only downside of this. But anything in the front, and I like that the chain is in the front, anything with the chain, anything with the front drive stuff, It's very simple. You have plenty of room. If you really need to, you remove this radiator, you have massive amounts of space. And one cool thing before we move on to your transmission, at the very front of the engine bay, there's this plaque. I love this plaque. This plaque does absolutely nothing for this car, but just seeing it makes me smile. It says, Wagoneer, born in America, designed in and built in the city where they were designed in. And just it has a little silhouette of the Wagoneer and then the American flag. I just love that. They always get this stuff right. And this one, just as soon as you open the hood, you see it. It's just a beautiful sight. Let's talk about the transmission and the four-wheel drive system of this truck. So there's actually one transmission option for this, for the Grand Wagoneer and the Wagoneer and all of the other trims. It is the 8 HP 75. It's a HP transmission by ZF. You'll see it across a lot of Jeep and Chrysler models. So this transmission has a couple, it's a really well-made transmission. It's a really rugged transmission with a few quirks, if you would. The first thing is, this transmission is always in park. This is going to not make sense initially, but bear with me. Let me explain. So this transmission, when you take hydraulic pressure out of it, it's going to default in park. So hydraulic pressure is what takes it out of park, which is something very interesting. You think that is a disaster waiting to happen, and in some cases it is. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you lose hydraulic pressure in this transmission for more than half an hour, it'll actually default into park. And because of that nature, you do have a manual release to put it neutral in case you need to push this car. In this particular one, it does sit right around the parking brake application area. As you see here, it's pretty simple. You just turn the key, pull a little lever, and that's about it. But this transmission can come in kind of two configuration, or three, you can say. So in the two-wheel drive models, it's just transmission, differential, and that's it. In the four-wheel drive model, there's actually two different transfer cases that hang to it. Let's dive into the four-wheel drive system and we'll explain. So there's three configurations: two-wheel drive, very simple. Then there is a little confusion on the naming here. I wish they would have worked a little bit better on the naming so you wouldn't have to start researching what these names mean. Could have just said it. The first one is Quadra Drive 1. And that is basically a full-time all-wheel drive. It's pretty sophisticated for what it is. It's a single speed. Nothing really fancy about it. There's no low range, but it is still, because it's a Jeep, it's a very capable all-wheel drive system. It does have a real transfer case, and it does have a real front differential, and things are a little heavier duty, and it's very well made software-wise, where it will break individual wheels and really help you get out of situations a lot more than your average all-wheel drive car. Then there's a second system, which is a proper four-wheel drive system. It does have a low range. It's a very clever system. It works really well. It does have a two-speed transfer case. That is the Quadra Drive 2, which is in this one. It is very capable. But again, there has to be one thing said. If you think you will be taking this on a mudding adventure on the top of the mountain alongside your Wrangler, I don't think it's a good idea. So really having that here is just living up to their Jeep heritage. It's very capable, but at the same time, you really want to take your giant behemoth of an off-roader with 22-inch wheels mudding. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's there if you need it. And then before we wrap up this section, the brakes. This does not have a brake booster, the vacuum operated one, which is pretty interesting what they did here. And a lot of manufacturers are moving away from brake boosters because they're too antiquated. They have a hydraulic kind of booster. So little motor pressurizes a little accumulator, and that's what gives you the kind of the assist, the power assist for the brakes. Pretty interesting units. Actually, in my opinion, it's not very large, and that is the cool thing about it. Now, before we completely wrap up this section, I will say one thing. First, looking around here and how things are made and how everything, I feel like there are certain things that are made well and certain things that are completely unnecessary, and this is sometimes I feel like the issue. They initially design things well, but then the manufacturing happens and they start adding things to make manufacturing easier. Like there's a particular coolant hose on the side. It's a coolant hose that goes and has a one-time use clamp, then goes into a plastic elbow, then that plastic elbow goes into another plastic thing, and then a little hose that takes it all away. Why can't we just make that a complete hose and avoid this whole plastic complication and the one-time use clamp and all that? See, these are the little things that I see a lot in domestic cars that just, you could have done this better. And then some of the plastics really don't feel like they're gonna last. And this was what contributes to the reliability. It's usually not the engine blowing up. It's usually the little stuff piles up and causes engine failures and whatnot. It's still here. And lastly, something we potentially missed, this car has 2 batteries. Very interesting. There's a very big battery here right next to it, and I love them for putting it there because this is very easy to access. This little battery, all it does is just take the transmission out of park. If the main battery dies and if it hasn't been off for more than half an hour, you can actually use this little battery to take the car out of park, and life is great. Now, let's talk about this engine from a kind of a driving perspective. It's very powerful. It makes over 500 horsepower. I mean, this more than makes up for the V8. Doesn't have a lot of lag. This part they got really right. But this is the problem that I see. They took the standard version, they made a few modifications, and they made this very powerful high output version, but it feels extremely high strung. I mean, some of the data is suggesting 26 psi of boost. That's a lot, folks. You start pushing this engine all the time, things not gonna last. It's way too high strung, and you feel it just driving it. Just me listening to how this engine sounds, you immediately notice it's very powerful, but it's also high strung. It's pushed, and you feel it. And that's the only concern with us moving away from V8s into smaller engines that are turbocharged. They're pushed to the limit. So reliability remains a question mark for this one. Let's take a look underneath the Grand Wagoneer, starting with something pretty interesting. I mean, this is a very expensive car, and a car that is kind of meant for off-road. I mean, it does have 2-speed, low range and whatnot. There is nothing covered up. Pretty quiet car, so it's not going to get dinged for that, but I wish there was a little bit more covering. Everything is kind of wide open. Nonetheless, let's start from the very beginning. This is actually an aero like little flap that comes down for aerodynamics. You notice it has a little motor over here. If you come all the way around, there's a little actuator here that pulls this whole thing down or up. Radiator is right here, at least one of the many radiators that this thing has. It's pretty interesting. This very big tank, which is in a very interesting spot right at the front. This is where the air suspension, so it would, store some air pressure here and can do its movements rapidly. This helps with the air suspension kind of rapid rise or lower. Works pretty good, actually. That part is pretty good. Speaking of the suspension, let's look at the front suspension here. So double wishbone suspension, lower aluminum control arm. And then the upper control arm, it kind of has a plastic appearance to it. It's actually not the case, just an inner lining that is plastic. It is a steel control arm. Knuckle is aluminum. Dual piston caliper, and it's a pretty large caliper. Of course, this is a massive behemoth. You do need that. The ball joint is part of the control arm, and it's not separate. That is not the best design for service long term, but again, that's what they went with. Full aluminum front differential. It's kind of interesting. I mean, aluminum, it's good for differentials, but for off-roading, you'd want to see cast iron that are a little stronger, but it's not the end of the world. But what is something of a theme when I look here with the mechanic's eyes, let's gaze our attention to this area right here. So if you look right here, right from this angle, this sensor is the oil level sensor, and then this is the actuator that engages the front differential. So if you want to replace that, you have to remove the actuator. They could have thought about this better, maybe redesigned this guy to go another way. They didn't, and that's okay. You notice these are CV axles. This is not like the Wrangler where it has a solid front axle, which is understandable. This over here, this massive behemoth, is the air shock. It's a pretty large air shock, and it does have a little actuator. This is actually the part that is on the shock itself. This is for the adaptive suspension. Works pretty good. I think the air suspension in this works pretty rapid and pretty nice. Then as we make our way around, this is the engine. You notice wide openings when you go around. I mean, this thing is just wide open on this side. On this side, you do have more stuff, but oil filter right here, drain plug right here. This is very accessible and very easy. Then we have this massive contraption of an exhaust that comes around. Two turbos, they both have each individual exhaust that comes out of it. And for some reason, the exhaust in this is over elaborate. We're going to talk about that. Here's that 8-speed transmission, very familiar sight with the plastic oil pan, transmission pan with the integrated filter that's part of it. This is ZF transmission, pretty cool transmission. It's actually a pretty good transmission, but there is more of that what were you thinking moment. If you look right here, right between these two exhaust pipes, that's where the drain for the transmission is. Now this is supposedly a lifetime transmission fluid, so I guess we're not going to have to worry about it, right? Well, no, but could have thought about this better, because the exhaust kind of wraps around and you can't, yeah, we're not going to remove the, if you need to do a filter, for example, you have to pull the exhaust. That's very interesting. Then the exhaust kind of goes up and down. There's dual pipes that go out, and then they go into this one muffler, and then it splits again. We're going to look at it in a bit. But before we move on from there, this is the transfer case. It's a pretty decent size. It's an actual transfer case with 2-speed transfer case on this particular model. Drain and fill clearly marked. I really, the automotive industry is starting to use these style plugs that you have to replace them every time. Really dislike them. I wish it was just a plug with a gasket. Would have been a lot better for service, but it's not the end of the world. Very interesting to see this. See, this is what tells you this truck is meant for some articulation, because you don't have a flex disc, you actually have a proper U-joint. Non-serviceable U-joint. There's no grease fittings here or anything, but hey, we do have a U-joint, and that is pretty cool. Massive fuel tank that literally starts from here, goes all the way near the rear differential. It's a massive fuel tank, and then a massive exhaust. Now the exhausts, historically with Jeep, they're not the highest quality. I mean, look at these, some of these welds, it's just the quality of everything. It's not the highest quality in the world, but historically that has been the case, so it's nothing to be surprised of. Every manufacturer will have their things. Some things will make well, some things they won't. Then the exhaust actually splits up here into two, and then it makes a very interesting jump over the frame and underneath, and then two dual tips. I feel like they could have worked on this exhaust a little better, but they didn't, and that's okay. That's what they decided to do. But before we move on past that, welcome to the biggest oversight. I feel like at some point they designed this truck and they totally forgot about the sway bar, and they drove it just didn't feel right, and they just let's just add it here. It just feels out of place. I feel like this would have wrapped better, but sway bar just sits right here. Now the rear suspension is a multi-link suspension. Some of it is aluminum, like the upper arms are aluminum, some of these lower arms are aluminum, and then you have a steel arm where the shock sits, the air shock. Again, air shock all around on this one. Very large caliper with an electronic parking brake, which is pretty cool. This is the one you want, basically, in my opinion. I never understand why manufacturers do this. It's almost like you're already stressing this joint. Why can't we just make this pipe go up? There must be a reason that I'm not thinking about right now, but this just could have done this better. Spare tire. It is not a full-size spare tire. This is an 18-inch spare tire, but hey, it's a spare tire. We won't complain about it. But what I will say, and this is not just Jeep, this is everybody in the automotive industry these days, wide gaps and wide openings. Could have, and then this is the image when you drive this truck on the highway. If we stand a little bit back and look at this whole thing, as the air comes in, this is what it's going to do. This whole thing will just start shaking like that. It's not the end of the world, but I mean, this is a little stuff that we could work a little bit better on. Again, not the end of the world, and it's okay. But what is super cool, and we're going to look at this a little bit more when we look outside. This has the side steps that come out. Very cool. I just wanted to show you the motor that actually actuates these. This is that motor. It basically just twists it and brings it out. Very quiet motor. Does have it's a little bit slow, especially towards the end of the application, but the coolest thing is it's part of the body. And of course, this is a body on frame truck. We kind of skipped over that. Very tall frame, and it's a frame. We're not going to talk about the sounds it makes, but it is a fully boxed in frame. This is an SUV. This is the standard stuff. You won't have an open section or an SUV like that. Pretty solid frame. With any frame, of course, if you have rust in the mix, you do want to protect it somehow. But I'm noticing a lot of openings. I hope they treated this frame on the inside well. But yeah, it's body on frame truck, even though it doesn't really feel like it when you drive it, thanks to that air suspension. Let's take a look at the outside of the Grand Wagoneer, starting with just looking at the whole thing. You know, there's something special about very large SUVs, and getting them right sometimes is difficult, that they don't look excessive. I think Jeep really got this one right. It is enormous, but it doesn't look over the top. They managed to keep the design to a point simple but very elegant. I mean, just look at these headlights. Let's look at this. It's very simple. You just have two little lenses. Everything else is blacked out. But it looks so elegant. And this kind of matte chrome ring around it, it just makes it look super elegant. And of course, the iconic Jeep look here with Wagoneer written here, very subtle. And it has this little gold accent at the edge of it. It looks super elegant. Folks, if there's anything they really got well in this one, is the way it looks, which is very difficult on large SUVs like this. Fog lights, they're actually double as turning lights as well. When you turn your turn signal, these will actually come on if the fog lights are off, which is pretty nice. And then more little details. You notice this little camera, which is the front camera for 360 camera, it has a little washer underneath it, so it washes it. And by that I mean it just makes everything in the front wet, doesn't do anything else. Radar sensor is pretty low in this car, and then you have two proper hooks. But what I like about this is they kind of made the hook match the color of the grille and the rest of the surrounding area. They didn't just leave it black, which I think looks pretty neat. Now this, as we looked underneath it, does have an aero flap that comes down to help with fuel economy and whatnot. The hood design is very interesting to me. In the front, it's just typical Jeep hood, comes in and kind of leans at the end, but it has this very nice subtle design in it, kind of an indentation. Gives it a very neat and just elegant look. Something about this car, it looks super elegant. As we wrap around the side, you know, you look at these wheels in a picture or whatnot, because this thing is massive. These are 22-inch wheels, optional. They really fit the character of this car, and they look very correct. And then I like that this is body color, and the side is really, there's not a lot going on, but what is going on looks very elegant. I love this chrome that ends here, and then you have body color here, and then it starts. This gives it a very elegant look. And there's a very subtle raise in the back glass here, just to give it kind of a design, not look like a giant box, even though they do not become more boxy than this. This is just a giant box, but it looks very elegant. And then something interesting in the door here. You have Grand Wagoneer and the American flag, which again with this gold accent, it looks very nice. You notice it takes up almost the whole door, and this is not a small door. They're really proud of the fact that this is a Grand Wagoneer. Now, this of course has a touchless key start, and you can lock and unlock both doors, and that is very right. They got that super right. But more important, you look at the very bottom rocker. Looks very nice, looks very elegant. But did you know that that is actually the side step? I love it. I think it's really cool. That is how it's hidden. I like that it comes down very low, where it's actually usable for a high car like this, and it's wide, and it feels right. A little slow, like, let me close it and we'll wait for it to retract. A little bit on the slow side, especially you watch to the very end. You open the door, it kind of opens, and then it just takes its time. You want to open the door and get in it, you have to wait for it to come all the way down, otherwise you're forcing it open. But nonetheless, I love that it doesn't just hide underneath the truck. They kind of purpose that rocker molding to be the side step as well. I think that is very cool. Then we wrap around it, and it takes you a minute to walk from the front to the back of this car because it's so big. this is to me is the best part of this car. This back, it's not flashy, but it's very elegant looking. I love how this thing looks, folks. These taillights, they're not over the top, and there is lights that run from the top all the way to here, but they look very, very elegant. And that's what you want in a car like this. I mean, it's very hard to make a car this big be elegant, but they did it, and it looks very nice. Now here you have a couple cameras. One of it's from the 360 and kind of the backup camera, and this one is actually the rear view mirror camera, and they both have their individual washers that does absolutely nothing. Just make everything wet here, so you can see here. Again, Grand Wagoneer written really large with the gold accent right here. I really like the way this looks. The only thing about it, and at least they tried to do it a little better, there's a lot of badging. This one says Quadra Drive 2, and this one says Series 3L. Things that make absolutely no sense. Let's translate. This is the type of four-wheel drive this car have, as we talked about, and this one is the over-confusing trim of this car in the L. We're going to talk about this in a little bit in the video, but yeah, but at least they're kind of symmetrical, except the L, but they are symmetrical. But let's open the back. Of course, this is power operated, and when it comes to SUVs like this is why you buy them. Folks, this is not the second row, this is the third row, and you have this much space. I mean, there are cars, there are SUVs you can buy today that they don't have this much space, even with behind the second row. And this thing, this is how much you have. And just for, that's the second row gone, and let's put the third row. With the exception of that center console that is optional, this is an enormous space. I can just see a very large couch going in here. But here's the best part about this. This is where I think they got this part of this car right. Even though this is really a people hauler, nobody will buy a car this large and expect it just to be a luxury car. This is a people hauler, but this carpet and this carpet, they really did it well, and this is really high quality. This is an aluminum rail that kind of moves around so you can secure your items. There is some storage here, not a lot, but there is some, and that is very nice. But I love the execution on the materials, and we're going to talk about this a little bit when we go inside. This door, just like all Chryslers and whatnot, you do have to do one of those deals where you press the button and run, so we're going to do this. So it does give you a second, but I don't understand why it's not on the window, but that's how Chrysler did it, and Jeep, same thing. And that is the outside of the Grand Wagoneer. Let's take a look at the interior of the Grand Wagoneer. And something has to be said. This particular model that we're testing, Series 3L Grand Wagoneer, fully loaded, it's $123,000. Usually when manufacturers ask that kind of price, they will go over the top to justify that high price. And sometimes that tends to start taking away from the functionality of the car. Here though, Jeep really did this well, folks. First, this interior at this high price feels every bit as expensive. All the materials, all the fit and finish, it's impeccable. That is really good, because usually you get in these really high-end cars and things feel like they took the cheap model and just wrapped it with leather. This doesn't feel like that. They did this well. But the most important thing is they did not take away the functionality. This is still a very large family SUV, and you're going to need it to do that very well to justify its price. We start with just the materials and fit finish. Very nice headliner material. The leather is very soft, and on top of that, the hard surfaces. You do have some piano black here and there, but you also have this very nice aluminum texture, and it just spreads across the dash. This is an option. There is also another option with wood trim that also looks very, very nice. Now let's start with the gauges. It's an all screen gauge, and usually I don't like these because they absolutely do nothing. Not here though. They really did well on this screen because you can display your map. There's a lot of customizations. You can even show some vital gauges and temperatures and whatnot. And then there is a night vision. That is a pretty cool option here. It's not the best night vision in the world, but hey, you have night vision if you need it. Then we move from that to the steering wheel. I like that for the most part, the steering wheel takes a minute to get used to the controls, but once you do, they're actually pretty intuitive, and they still have your volume in the back and skip in the back. And I love that they didn't put the paddle shifters on a car like this. It absolutely makes no sense. You don't need it, so they didn't, and I love that. But moving on from that to the center stack, folks, Chrysler infotainment system, the Uconnect stuff, it's one of the best stuff I've tested so far. It's very intuitive. It's very well thought out. It's very quick. And I really haven't had it kind of have bugs or stop working or glitching. No, this is one of the best infotainment systems I have tested so far by a mile, in my opinion. But even with that sophisticated infotainment system, I love that they did one thing right. They kept things simple. You're not going to buy this car because you're into technology and gizmos and whatnot. You buy this car because you have a large family that you need to haul. And you don't need to be busy figuring out how everything works. I love that the climate control are physical buttons. Everything is physical button. You don't even need to operate the screen. And then underneath it, you have even more control. But the controls underneath it are these touch capacitive, and they kind of buzz when you activate something. They can get a little annoying, but hey, they're physical buttons-ish nonetheless. Same thing with I feel like they really went out of their way to put physical-ish control, the heated and cooled seats in the front. That is really a welcome thing. But I can't get beyond how nice this interior is. It's very, very nice. But then you start to get a feeling like, okay, this isn't a conservative, old school interior. Oh, it is not. Because the gauge is a screen. You have an infotainment system that is not over the top size-wise, but it is pretty large for the size of this car. But then underneath it, you have another screen with multiple additional controls. Like you can adjust your seats, but you can further adjust your seats and further adjust your climate control for the rear and the front and all that. But the best part is if you don't want the screen, you can actually open it and there's a wireless charger behind it. Kind of a perfect hiding spot for things. But wait, that is not all. The passenger also gets a screen. There's kind of a co-pilot screen, which I think is very cool. And then there's 2 more screens in the back. This is not a conservative interior. I feel like what they did well here is they had a kind of a perfect blend. You have physical button stuff and physical button climate control and things that you use every day, they're physical button. But on the technology front, they also gave you a lot to make you feel like this is an advanced car. And it is. It does have a lot of really nice features. But what I like more about it is they didn't just put screens randomly just to make it wow and flashy. They're actually functional. You sit in the passenger seat. This is a big thing. You have a screen in front of you. You don't have to glance over here to see things. And the same thing with this screen. Instead of having all very busy here with all your additional seat control and whatnot, you have a dedicated screen to that. And then the gauge being a screen, it's actually, they spent the time to make it worth being a screen, not just a screen that displays 2 gauges just for the sake of looking cool. And then we move past that. The center console is massive and it's a cool box, and that is pretty cool. But then you have a little teeny tiny area right here. They didn't compromise on usability just to make things look cool, and I respect that. The only thing which he kind of glanced over, I think, this giant behemoth of a car has one of the tiniest glove boxes I've ever seen in a car. Don't know why. I mean, you put the owner's manual there, that's it, the end of the glove box. I wish they could have fixed that. And then there is the seat controls. Interesting, the only manufacturer that I've seen that puts their seat control on the door is Mercedes-Benz and this Jeep. So the controls are on the door, and this seat's super comfortable and very adjustable. You can even adjust the bolsters, you can adjust the upper part of the seat, and there's a lot of adjustability, and I respect that. But the interesting thing is, instead of where your normal seat controls would be, you have Grand Wagoneer written very, very large and lit. And then on the steering wheel, very large, Grand Wagoneer. And then on the dash, Grand Wagoneer. I think you got a little carried away with that. To their defense, though, they used a really nice font, and everything feels very elegant, sophisticated. And then on the seats, you have Series 3, just so you remember that confusing trim. A little bit carried away with the signage, but at least it was done well. Now, this car, driving it, it's very smooth, and that is thanks to the excellent air suspension, which is highly adjustable. You have a toggle right here, has a lot of steps of adjustability, which I really like. Next to it, you also have a similar toggle, which feels really nice for the driving mode. And I love that they didn't put 7 different sport modes. No, most of them are actually off-road modes. It's just one of them is auto and then a sport or dynamic. And then the shifter is the rotary dial. I really don't like the rotary dials. You can get annoying if you're doing a multi-point turn, especially in something this big. But you might not be doing as many multi-point turns, because the turning circle in this car is pretty impressive. For a car this big, it is actually a pretty tight turning circle in the real world. And I like that. That is pretty cool. Let's take a look at the second row of the Grand Wagoneer. I'm 5'7". This is my driving position. And of course, you get in a truck like this, it's massive. But I think there is a combination of really good things here that are really special. I wish everybody would do that, starting with these screens. See, here's the rundown of rear entertainment screens on cars. The first year that comes out, it's great. 2 years later, it is outdated, absolute, just redundancy that doesn't work, doesn't interact with anything, and is slow and glitchy. But here's what Jeep did that I really respect and like. This is not made by Jeep. It's actually a Fire Stick. Look at that remote. Does it look familiar? This is a Fire Stick. You basically have the exact same system that gets constant update from another company that works very well. You can watch anything you want here. YouTube, Amazon Prime, Netflix, whatnot, without having to really deal with some proprietary system that doesn't work. That's the same case for both screens. The best part is, because it is a Fire TV, most people are already familiar with how this works, including your kids. And then the best thing is, you can use this remote wherever. And that's something not thanks to Jeep, thanks to Fire TV. You don't have to point this here. You could be sitting in the back and operate it and not even point it at it, and they work. And there's 2 remotes for each screen, and that is really cool. But then let's look into the smaller details. Now, this particular one has this console. I usually don't like these consoles. First, you lose a seat. Second, it doesn't. I wish if we were going to have captain chairs, you can have access to the 3rd row without rolling the seat. Well, that's okay. It's an option. But it is a nice option, though, because you do have this massive center console here. You have the screen for all kinds of controls. But more to this. Look at this seat. So the leather doesn't actually wrap around full. You can see where it ends here with a really nice leather, but this is still matching color and has stitching on it. It's a very nice feel to it. At least if they're not going to give you a full leather seat, they made it extremely nice in the back. And that's what you want to see when you're paying this high price for this car. Now, in the back, of course, you have all kinds of different types of charging cables. You have USB-A, USB-C, you have a standard house outlet 110, and then you have 4 HVAC vents, which I really like, especially this one on the pillar. It takes a lot to do this pillar vent, so I'm glad that they did that. It looks very nice. Now, this car potentially, this particular model, potentially was meant to be kind of a cross between chauffeur-driven and family SUV, because you do have a lock-unlock button on the door, which you can actually disable from the front if you have kids here. But one thing they skipped at this price level, it would be nice to have, is we have a window shade, which is very nice, but a manual window shade on a $100,000+ car. Would it be nice if this was power? Would have made it even better. Let's talk about the 3rd row seat of the Grand Wagoneer. And I will sum this up with something very simple. This 3rd row seat is more comfortable than many SUVs' 2nd row seat, and some of them the 1st row, the driver's seat. Folks, this is why you buy this SUV, because this, if you sit 3 adults here and hold them on a 12-hour drive, they should not complain. And if they do, well, I don't think there's anything better than this size-wise. Super comfortable seats, plenty of knee room. The floor is not very low. This is basically the same as the second row, even the first row. That's how good this is. But more of that, you do have a vent here, you do have a USB-A, USB-C, and then the seat actually reclines a little bit and you have some adjustability, which is very nice. Not a lot, but hey, something is better than nothing. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the Grand Wagoneer. And small disclaimer before we start, I am slightly biased toward giant American-made SUVs. Not big SUVs. This is not a big SUV. This is a massive behemoth that would only work in countries like the United States, maybe Canada, maybe Australia. Nowhere else in the world would you be able to drive something this big because the roads simply aren't designed for it. That's just the fact of it. So I love these giant SUVs because they don't exist anywhere else. And with that, there are a few things with this car. I think the biggest thing is the engine feel. Not necessarily how it's made or all the other stuff, although there are a few things that they could have been done better, but it feels high-strung, and it is, especially in the high output model. It's pushed to the limit and it feels it. You accelerate in this car, you have no problems accelerating. I mean, this is a very heavy truck, it's huge, and it takes off very quickly. But you feel the engine it's pushed to the limit, and you feel it. And it kind of starts to intrude on the quality of the ride. It feels too buzzy, too high-strung. I hope that makes sense. And then the other thing is, you get past everything you don't like about it and you want to go buy one. It is the most confusing trim system I have ever run into. So there's the Wagoneer and then there's the Grand Wagoneer. They're two separate models. And then within each one there is a regular one and then there's an L. And then after that there is Series 2 and Series 3 and Carbide and this model and that model. And this one has the standard output. Too confusing. And they just dropped the V8 out of it and now the high output model came in. Too confusing of a lineup, and I think they could easily simplify it a little bit for the buyer, because I feel like there's Series 2, Series 3, but there's no Series 1. And then why are we calling it Series to begin with? Why don't we just call it Trim 1, Trim 2, Trim 3? And yeah, they could have simplified the trims a little bit. I think it would make more sense to most average folk. But then the biggest thing, I think, from a mechanical standpoint, long-term reliability. Now, Jeep is not known to make ultra-reliable cars, 15, 20-year-old run perfect. That's not their thing, and that's fine. But with this new engine and kind of high-strung engine and high-performance engine, it adds a little bit to that. And that's one thing. You buy an SUV like this, don't expect it to last 25 years without anything breaking. That's not the philosophy of this truck. But the years that you will have it, while it's under warranty and whatnot, I really like this truck. It looks elegant, and there's a lot of good in this truck, folks, once you look beyond reliability. So should you buy a Jeep Grand Wagoneer, Wagoneer, Series 2, Series 3, and all this confusion? Let's get away from the confusion for a moment to say one thing. This is a truly beautiful, elegant truck. And in this segment of giant behemoths that really only works in a few countries in the world, one of them is where we live, the good old USA. There are really two competitors for this truck that I can think of from the domestic market in the US. There is the Cadillac Escalade, and then there is the Lincoln Navigator. In all fairness, I have not driven a Lincoln Navigator in its latest iteration, but I have the Cadillac Escalade. So I can draw one conclusion. The Cadillac Escalade is initially very flashy, very nice looking, but then after a few days of living with it, you start to feel it too much. And I feel like, even though they did really good with it inside, but the outside is too much. This looks elegant, looks sophisticated. And the biggest thing about this is they did not just get carried away just to make it flashy and over the top. They actually kept the functionality. Even when you option it out at the fully decked out one like this one at $123,000 for a Jeep, yes, I know, it's a very nice place to be in. Not only from a material and build quality inside and kind of fit finish on everything, but the functionality. You can still haul your large family in this very comfortably, and it will not, the modernness of it will not get in the way. And speaking of modernness, I feel like even though this has a very large number of screens all over the place, the important stuff is still physical button. To a point, they're not completely physical, they are that touch capacitive thing, but hey, they're better than fumbling through a screen just to turn on the seat heater, which I like. This adds to it. It's not all screen and gizmos and just flashiness. No, there's some classic. It doesn't take you a lot to get used to how this car works. There's a lot to get used to, especially in this particular one. But I feel like this department, they did it better than the Escalade. Now, no SUV is perfect, of course. One thing that affects this, and equally all the cars in this segment, long-term reliability is not one of his strong suits. And the other thing is the engine. I really like the technology in the engine. There's a few things I don't really like about it, but overall, if this is going to replace the V8s, we're doing pretty good because this engine is pretty powerful and hauls this giant behemoth very quickly. But the only thing about it is it feels high-strung. It's not refined, the sound it makes. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but when you're paying this much for a car like this, you want things to be nice and refined. And this engine simply is not, it's too high strung. Let's put it this way. You get into the Cadillac Escalade with a big V8, it just feels smoother. It feels correct. This one, not so much. And the other thing is the confusion of the trims. If this is Series 2, Series 3, carbide, or is this a Grand Wagoneer L, or just a Wagoneer, or just a Wagoneer L? It's very confusing, all the trims and all the stuff. I think that could easily change with a little bit of tweaking from Jeep. But other than that, I truly like this. If you're looking for a really, really large SUV, and the Cadillac Escalade is a bit much, this is very nice. It looks elegant. It functions well, and that's the most important thing, at least to me. And yes, the prices are high, but at least for that price, one good look inside of it and you drive it for a day, you feel like you're not just spending money just for the sake of it. You see where the materials are nice and everything is done well on the inside and equally on the outside. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.